History has a way of disguising uncertainty. When we look backward, events seem orderly, purposeful, almost scripted. The United States exists, therefore it feels as though it was always meant to exist. The American Revolution becomes a story of inevitability, a righteous uprising, a united people, a triumphant victory. But this is a story written after the fact. In real time, nothing about the revolution felt secure. Nothing about independence felt guaranteed. In truth, the birth of the United States was one of the most precarious political experiments in modern history, balanced on the edge of failure for far longer than success. To understand what it would mean for America to lose the revolution, we must first strip away the myths that surround its beginning. The 13 colonies were not a nation waiting to be born. They were a collection of societies with different economies, different religions, different political traditions, and different relationships to Britain. A merchant in Boston, a planter in Virginia, and a farmer on the Pennsylvania frontier did not experience empire in the same way, nor did they imagine the future in the same terms. For decades, British rule over the colonies had been relatively light. Local assemblies governed daily life. Taxes were low compared to those paid by citizens in Britain itself. The crown was distant, often abstract. Many colonists considered themselves loyal British subjects, proud of their place within the most powerful empire in the world. When tensions began to rise after the 7 Years' War, they were not driven by dreams of independence, but by demands for recognition, fairness, and autonomy within the imperial system. The crisis that followed was gradual, confused, and deeply contested. Parliamentary taxes such as the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties angered colonial elites not simply because of economic burden, but because of principle. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," was not a revolutionary call for separation. It was a demand for inclusion. Colonists argued that as British subjects, they deserved the same political rights as those living in Britain. At this stage, independence was a radical idea held by a minority. Even as protests intensified, most colonists hoped for reconciliation. They petitioned the king. They boycotted British goods. They argued within the framework of the empire. When violence erupted in places like Lexington and Concord, it was not immediately clear that it meant war, let alone revolution. Many still believed the crisis could be resolved. This uncertainty extended deeply into colonial society. Estimates suggest that during the war, only about 1/3 of the population actively supported independence. Another third remained loyal to the crown, while the rest tried to remain neutral, concerned less with ideology than with survival. This was not a united people rising as one. It was a fractured society pulled into conflict by circumstances it did not fully control. The revolutionary leadership itself was far from unanimous. Figures like George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson are remembered today as architects of independence, but even they arrived at revolution reluctantly. Many had careers, reputations, and property tied to the imperial system. To rebel was to risk everything, not only their lives, but their social standing, their wealth, and their families' futures. They understood the magnitude of what they were attempting, and they understood how likely failure was. That failure nearly came many times. The Continental Army, often portrayed as a determined force marching steadily toward victory, was in reality chronically underfunded, undersupplied, and poorly trained. Soldiers lacked uniforms, weapons, and food. Desertion was common. Morale was fragile. Washington spent much of the war not defeating the British, but simply trying to keep his army alive long enough to remain relevant.
Britain, by contrast, possessed professional soldiers, experienced officers, and the most powerful navy in the world. It controlled major ports and cities, including New York, for much of the war. It could move troops across the Atlantic and supply them through global trade networks. The idea that a group of colonies could defeat such a power was, by any rational measure, improbable. The British did not lose because they were incapable of winning militarily. They lost because the war became politically exhausting. Distance complicated command. Loyalist support proved unreliable. The cost of suppressing rebellion across such a vast territory grew increasingly unpopular at home. The conflict became one theater among many in a global struggle, especially after France entered the war. And here lies one of the most important contingencies in the entire story. Without France, American independence almost certainly fails. French intervention provided money, weapons, training, troops, and, most critically, naval power. It transformed the conflict from a colonial rebellion into an international war. The decisive victory at Yorktown was not simply an American triumph, it was a Franco-American operation made possible by French ships blocking British escape. Had France chosen caution over revenge, had it decided that weakening Britain was not worth the risk, the revolutionaries would have stood alone, and alone they were unlikely to prevail. This is not speculation, it was the fear of the revolutionaries themselves. American leaders knew they were outmatched. They gambled on foreign intervention because they had no other choice. Independence was not a plan built on strength, it was a strategy born of desperation. Now imagine that gamble failing. Imagine France staying neutral. Imagine British naval dominance remaining unchallenged. Imagine the Continental Army continuing to retreat, to shrink, to fracture. Imagine colonial fatigue setting in as years of war bring economic collapse, displacement, and fear. Imagine loyalists regaining confidence as British authority reasserts itself city by city. In this scenario, the rebellion does not end in dramatic defeat, it ends in exhaustion. Negotiations begin, not for independence, but for peace within the empire. Britain offers amnesty to rebels willing to lay down arms. Leaders face impossible choices, continue fighting a war they cannot win, or accept compromise to save what remains. Some flee, some surrender, some attempt to reshape the outcome through political reform rather than separation. The revolution fades not with a final battle, but with a quiet acknowledgement of reality. The consequences of this outcome are profound. First, there is no moment of founding, no declaration of independence proclaiming universal rights, no revolutionary constitution designed to limit power through written law. Instead, political change unfolds gradually through negotiation and imperial reform. Britain, having learned the cost of rigid governance, adjusts its approach. Colonial assemblies gain more authority. Representation within Parliament is debated. The empire evolves, not collapses. Second, the ideological impact of the revolution disappears. The American Revolution mattered not only because it succeeded, but because it demonstrated that Enlightenment ideals could be transformed into a functioning state. Without that demonstration, ideas of popular sovereignty and republican government remain largely theoretical, powerful, inspiring, but unproven. The world watches America closely during the late 18th century. Its success sends a signal. Monarchy is not inevitable, and legitimacy can flow from the people. If that signal never comes, the political imagination of the modern world narrows. Change still happens, but more cautiously, more slowly, more within existing hierarchies. Third, American identity itself never fully forms. Without independence, there is no singular national story binding 13 colonies together. Regional identities remain stronger than any shared sense of Americanness. People think of themselves as Virginians, New Yorkers, Pennsylvanians, British subjects first, colonial citizens second. The idea of a unified continental republic remains unrealized. This matters because nations are not only political entities, they are stories people agree to believe. Without a revolution to anchor that story, the emotional core of American identity never solidifies. And yet, this is not the end of the story, because even if the revolution fails, the forces that gave rise to it do not vanish. Economic growth continues, population expands, political expectations rise. People who have tasted resistance do not forget it easily. The empire must now govern a society that has learned how to challenge authority. The question is no longer whether change will come, but how. In the next part, we will explore what happens after the revolution fails, how Britain restructures its rule, how colonial society adapts, and how a different kind of North America begins to take shape, one not born in rebellion, but forged through compromise, control, and slow transformation. Because sometimes history does not turn on victory or defeat. Sometimes it turns on what survives after hope seems lost.
What if America had lost the revolution? The collapse of the revolutionary effort in North America would not have been sudden or violent, at least not in the way we imagine. It would have been a slow, grinding retreat of hope, an erosion of resistance under the weight of an overwhelming empire. The British forces, while never invincible, would have methodically regained control of key cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, establishing fortified garrisons and administrative centers. The Continental Army, weakened and demoralized, would have disbanded in stages, its soldiers returning to homes ravaged by war, their families struggling to survive amidst shortages, inflation, and uncertainty. The first consequence of such a failure would have been psychological. The colonies, having tasted the possibility of independence, would feel both shame and relief, the shame of defeat tempered by the relief of survival. Loyalists, emboldened by British victories, would reassert themselves in local politics, taking positions in colonial governments, courts, and militias. They would act as intermediaries between the empire and the local population, ensuring compliance while mitigating resentment. This would create a delicate balance, governance imposed from London, yet mediated by those who understood colonial society intimately. Britain, recognizing the fragility of control, would likely introduce reforms to prevent future rebellions. Representation, previously promised but never fully realized, might be offered to colonial elites. Local assemblies would regain some authority, perhaps with formal recognition from Parliament. Governors appointed by the Crown would retain ultimate power, but practical administration would rely on cooperation with colonial leaders. Taxes would be adjusted, and punitive measures tempered to avoid inflaming further unrest. In effect, the empire would evolve into a semi-autonomous federation, still united under the crown, but more flexible and politically sophisticated. Yet this reassertion of imperial authority would not erase the revolutionary impulse entirely. Ideas of liberty, natural rights, and self-government, having been widely circulated, would continue to spread Enlightenment thought. Newspapers, pamphlets, and private correspondence would continue to spread Enlightenment thought. Young men and women educated in the philosophies of Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau would remain restless. Even defeated, the colonies would retain a consciousness of possibility, a sense that another moment of opportunity might arise. Economically, the British victory would stabilize trade and markets, but it would also reassert imperial priorities. Raw materials, agricultural goods, and manufactured products would continue to flow toward Britain. The colonies would remain subordinate suppliers within a global mercantile system. Local industries would grow slowly, regulated to prevent competition with British manufacturers.
The economic development of North America would be shaped by imperial strategy rather than independent initiative. Cities would rebuild, ports would reopen, and commerce would resume, but under the constant shadow of imperial oversight. Slavery, a contentious institution in the colonies, would follow a very different path. The American Revolution accelerated debates about freedom and human rights, even as it left the institution intact in the South. In a world where the Revolution failed, slavery might have ended differently. Britain abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833. Under continued imperial control, North American colonies could have seen emancipation imposed from London decades earlier than in the United States. The social and political conflicts that led to the Civil War might have been avoided, replaced by a more centralized and orderly process of abolition. Yet racial hierarchies and prejudice would remain deeply ingrained, evolving along lines dictated by imperial authority rather than domestic conflict. The territorial expansion of North America would also be altered. Without an independent America, westward migration would proceed under imperial regulation. Settlement of western territories, negotiations with indigenous nations, and the management of frontier disputes would be centralized through London rather than a national capital in Philadelphia or Washington. This may have slowed the pace of expansion, resulting in fewer violent conflicts, at least in the short term. Native American nations might retain stronger autonomy in some regions, protected by treaties enforced by imperial policy, rather than overridden by an expansionist republic. Internationally, the absence of an independent America would change the balance of power. France, having refrained from intervention or suffered a failed alliance, would be more cautious in Europe. Revolutionary movements elsewhere would lack the example of a successful continental republic. The French Revolution might still occur, but perhaps later, more cautiously and with less confidence in the viability of republican government. Monarchies across Europe would observe the failed American experiment and feel emboldened to resist demands for reform, delaying the spread of liberal constitutionalism.
The global economy would evolve differently. The United States, in our world, became a key economic actor, shaping trade, finance, and industrial innovation. Without independence, North America's economy would be integrated into the British system, with London as the dominant center of commerce. Wall Street would never emerge as the world's financial hub. American industry would develop, but within the constraints of imperial priorities. The Industrial Revolution in North America might be slower, less entrepreneurial, less transformative. Politically, the colonies would gradually adapt to semi-autonomous governance. Local leaders, formerly rebels or neutral parties, would take positions within colonial administrations. Assemblies would debate taxation, infrastructure, and social policy. These debates, while constrained by imperial oversight, would cultivate a political culture familiar with negotiation, compromise, and limited self-rule. Over generations, this could produce societies capable of independent thought and eventual autonomy, but without the dramatic rupture of revolution. By the mid-19th century, the world would have adapted to a North America still under British rule. The principles of Enlightenment thought would continue to circulate, shaping education, law, and public debate. However, the psychological and cultural impact of the revolution's failure would leave an imprint, a cautionary understanding of the limits of action against established power. Revolutionary fervor might persist, but it would be tempered by experience, restraint, and the recognition of practical risk. Culturally, the mythos of the frontier, individual liberty, and self-made citizenship would be different. North Americans would identify as subjects of the crown rather than citizens of a nation. Literature, art, and public discourse would reflect imperial values, even as they absorbed Enlightenment ideals. The American story as a tale of rebellion, independence, and experimentation would not exist. Instead, the narrative would be one of adaptation,
negotiation, and cautious progress within a global empire. The failure of independence would also ripple through other colonies around the world. If North America could not establish a republic, the ideological argument for self-determination would be weakened elsewhere. Latin American independence movements might face greater resistance, delayed victories, or even suppression. Colonial empires in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean would observe a cautionary tale. Rebellion can be defeated, and empires, if adaptive, can endure. Even wars of the late 18th and early 19th centuries would unfold differently. The War of 1812, as it occurred in our timeline, would be meaningless. Border disputes between independent nations would not exist. British territorial authority would remain intact. European conflicts might involve North America indirectly, but the continent itself would remain under imperial oversight. The strategic calculations of Britain, France, and later the United States would be fundamentally altered. Socially, the colonies would evolve in a more gradualist fashion. Immigration would continue, cities would grow, commerce would expand, but political and social change would occur incrementally rather than through revolutionary rupture. Education systems would promote loyalty to empire while incorporating Enlightenment thought. A new political class, trained in administration rather than rebellion, would emerge to manage the delicate balance of colonial governance. By the late 19th century, the notion of an independent United States might no longer seem urgent. The colonies, accustomed to autonomy within empire, could evolve into dominions similar to Canada or Australia, self-governing, prosperous, and loyal to the crown. Independence might eventually arrive through negotiation and consent rather than war. But the ideological fire of 1776, the dramatic experiment in self-rule, would be absent. In this world, the long-term trajectory of North America is shaped by pragmatism rather than idealism, stability rather than revolution. The principles that underpinned the United States in our timeline, written constitutions, federalism, explicit rights, and a strong sense of national identity, emerge differently, delayed and diluted by imperial control. The global influence of these principles, which inspired generations of revolutionaries, would be muted. Yet the lesson remains profound. Even in failure, the impulses that drove revolution do not vanish. The colonies would continue to negotiate, resist, and adapt. Ideas persist, sometimes quietly, sometimes explosively, waiting for conditions that allow them to flourish. The British Empire, forced to reconcile control with concession, would itself be transformed, perhaps more resilient, perhaps more accommodating, and certainly more aware that power must be exercised with wisdom. In imagining a North America where the revolution failed, we confront a fundamental truth. History is contingent. Empires do not fall automatically. Independence is not inevitable. Every moment of apparent certainty rests upon countless fragile choices, alliances, and accidents. The story of 1776 is not only about victory, it is about the precariousness of possibility and the enduring human capacity to shape it, even when success is far from guaranteed.
What if America had lost the revolution? By the dawn of the 19th century, the failure of the American Revolution would have already reshaped the continent. North America, still under British dominion, would function as a stable, semi-autonomous empire. Cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston would thrive, not as capitals of a new nation, but as provincial hubs within a global empire, connected to London through trade, governance, and military protection. The vast Western territories would be explored and settled more methodically, regulated by imperial law rather than the bold, often chaotic ambition of an independent republic. The frontier would exist, but it would be shaped by negotiation, treaties, and imperial oversight, rather than relentless expansion and conflict.
Without a sovereign United States to inspire or challenge other nations, the ideological landscape of the world shifts dramatically. The French Revolution, though still influenced by Enlightenment thought, might occur later and with less confidence. Without the example of a functioning republic across the Atlantic, French reformers would hesitate. Monarchies in Europe would resist change with renewed vigor, bolstered by the knowledge that rebellion in North America had been contained. Revolutionary movements in Latin America and beyond would face similar discouragement. The notion that colonial peoples could successfully overthrow imperial authority would lose its most compelling case study. History would move more slowly, with progress measured in incremental reform rather than revolutionary rupture. Slavery, a contentious institution in North America, would follow a different trajectory. Britain abolished slavery across its empire in 1833. The colonies in North America, still under imperial rule, would likely see emancipation imposed more systematically and earlier than the piecemeal and violent path of abolition in the United States. The absence of a domestic civil war would spare the continent decades of internal bloodshed, but racial prejudice, systemic inequality, and exploitation would persist. Social hierarchies would remain influenced by colonial structures rather than the fractured legacy of rebellion, but the mechanisms of change would be centralized, orderly, and controlled from London. Economically, a British-controlled North America would be woven tightly into global trade networks dominated by the empire. Industrialization would proceed, but according to imperial priorities. Railroads, ports, and industries would expand, yet innovation would be channeled toward British needs. There would be no independent American finance, no Wall Street commanding global capital. The 19th century would be defined by European industrial centers, with North America contributing resources and labor rather than directing economic revolution. By the 20th century, the absence of a powerful United States would reshape global conflict and diplomacy. World War I, for example, would unfold without American military intervention, fundamentally altering its duration and outcome. European powers, lacking American support and financial backing, might be forced into different strategies, resulting in alternative treaties, borders, and post-war politics. The ideological consequences, the rise of totalitarian regimes in response to perceived injustice, might still emerge, but in altered form. Global power would remain European-centered, with Britain, Germany, and France vying for influence, while North America plays a supporting rather than leading role. World War II would likewise be transformed. Without American industrial and military dominance, the balance of power shifts dramatically. Alliances, invasions, and occupations would proceed under different calculations. The concept of the American century, so integral to 20th century geopolitics, would be absent. Institutions like the United Nations, NATO, and the World Bank would either not exist or emerge in entirely different forms, reflecting the continued centrality of European and imperial powers. Culturally, the ripple effects are equally profound. American literature, film, music, and intellectual innovation would not dominate global consciousness. English would remain influential, but its cultural form would reflect British imperial norms rather than the rebellious entrepreneurial spirit that shaped the United States. The mythos of the frontier, the ideal of self-made success, and the belief in popular sovereignty as a tangible reality would exist primarily as theory, not lived experience. Ideas of freedom and individual rights would circulate, but without a successful American model to illustrate their practical implementation, they might lack compelling proof. In the absence of an independent America, the world of ideas, the philosophical, political, and economic currents that flowed outward from the new republic, would be muted. Revolutions and reform movements around the globe would rely more heavily on European examples of constitutional monarchy and parliamentary reform, rather than revolutionary republicanism. The imagination of ordinary people would be constrained by precedent. Independence is possible, perhaps, but only with careful negotiation and imperial permission. And yet, even in failure, the revolutionary impulse endures. North Americans would continue to debate rights, governance, and justice. Semi-autonomous assemblies would cultivate political awareness. Civic engagement, although confined, would flourish in local communities. Intellectual and cultural ferment would persist as ideas introduced by the revolutionaries seeped into education, literature, and public discourse. History, after all, moves in waves, not linear steps. Even the suppressed or delayed can resurface under favorable conditions. By the late 19th century, the former colonies might resemble dominions like Canada or Australia, self-governing in practice, prosperous, and loyal to the crown. Independence, if it comes at all, would arrive peacefully, gradually, and without the ideological fire that defined 1776. The world would be quieter, more ordered, and perhaps safer in certain respects, but it would also lack the defining experiment of American republicanism, a living, breathing example that ordinary people could shape government, law, and society on their own terms. The story of what might have been reminds us that history is never predetermined. The existence of the United States, its influence of its ideas, the cultural, political, and economic power it wields today, all of it rests upon fragile choices, fortunate alliances, and the courage of people who acted despite uncertainty. The revolution succeeded because the stars aligned, because France chose to intervene, because Washington held his army together, because ordinary citizens committed to a risky vision. Remove any one of these variables, and the world we know might have been profoundly different. A world without the United States is not unrecognizable. It is still populated by nations, cultures, and empires, but it is fundamentally altered. The spread of democratic ideals, the trajectory of industrialization, the rhythms of global power, the cultural imagination, the very sense of possibility, all would shift. Europe remains dominant, colonial structures persist, and the North American continent develops along slower, more centralized lines. In reflecting on this alternative history, we are reminded that the past is not a series of inevitable events, but a network of possibilities. The triumph of the revolution was not predetermined. It was the product of courage, contingency, and circumstance. And the story that emerges from imagining its failure is as instructive as the story of its success. It shows us the fragility of freedom, the contingency of power, and the enduring importance of choice. Ultimately, to consider what might have happened if America had lost is to recognize the immense significance of small decisions, timely alliances, and human determination. It is to understand that history is a series of forks in the road, each one capable of producing a dramatically different world. And it is to acknowledge the fragile miracle of the United States itself, a nation born against long odds, whose influence has shaped the modern world in ways that are still unfolding. History is never fixed. Its currents are unpredictable, its consequences immense, and the lesson of imagining a lost revolution is both simple and profound. The world we know is the product of extraordinary chance, and the possibilities that were lost are as real and instructive as the victories that define our memory.